Hi everyone, and welcome to this live lesson all about sharks. Why do we need sharks to protect the ocean? Very shortly, we're going to have a fantastic presentation from Greg, who is a marine and shark educator and conservationist. And the fab thing today is that he will be able to join us live at the end of the presentation to answer all of your questions. Now, this live lesson is part of a series of live lessons and other resources to celebrate World Ocean Day. And you can find more of those resources on the worldoceanday.school website. So do head over there if you haven't been there already. Before we start, my name is Jamie from Encounter EDU, and I will be your host for today to take you through a few of the admin points. To the side of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A app, and that is where you can pop in all your questions about sharks. Don't worry about putting them in up front. You can add them as we go through the talk. You can also upvote questions that you see. So if there's somebody already asked that, just click the thumbs up button and that will move it higher up the queue. In terms of names, you can post anonymously, or if you're a school, it's great just to add a teacher or class name. Please no identifiable information for the young people watching. If you have any technical issues with the stream or wondering how things work, of course, please do click the speech bubble, and that's at the bottom of each page on the Encounter EDU website. And someone from the support team will be able, hopefully, to answer and sort out all your queries. And a quick point about viewing this in a classroom context, please do put the video full screen, because you can always get the chat app if you have a smartphone to hand, and just go to the same lesson page and you can enter any questions on a smartphone and leave the screen full at the front of the class. We do have some very special shout outs for this live lesson too. We've got classes from the UK, Canada and the USA joining us, but a big shout out, and this is to Oscar on Anglesey. And he said, please, could you say the biggest hello to one of your biggest fans ever, Greg, when you come on at the end. If you're watching this on catch up, I think he means you rather than me. This is the lesson he is most looking forward to, and he knows, I think Greg knows more about sharks than I do. Well, we'll find out in a bit, Oscar. And this is a hi to everyone at Oakfield Academy in Frome, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and that's from Mr. G. Thank you so much for putting that through. King's Court School have all dressed up in blue today to celebrate World Ocean Day. Fantastic, everyone at King's Court. We are looking forward to the session about sharks, and we love to have you with this live lesson too. And a big welcome to Miss Sutton and her geographers, and they are at Chaucer School in Sheffield. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Greg's pre-recorded presentation, and we'll see you at the end. And I'm really looking forward to talking to Greg and to posing your questions all about sharks and their importance for our wonderful ocean.
Hello and welcome to World Oceans Day for Schools 2021. I hope a lot of you have had an amazing few days learning loads of cool facts and interesting stuff about the oceans with the amazing resources that have been put on by World Oceans Day for Schools over the last few days. Now, many of you will know that today's theme is how can we protect the biodiversity of the oceans? And so I'm here to talk to you guys today about why sharks are so vital in the ecosystem in order to protect that biodiversity that we see in the oceans. So let's dive straight in. Now, many of you may recognize me from my talk last year at World Oceans Day for Schools, but for those of you who haven't seen me talk before, let me give you a quick background on how I got to be here talking to you about sharks today. So I started diving around 8 or 9 years ago, And as soon as I hit the water, I just fell in love with the underwater world. It was just such a special place that I just wanted to explore and find out more about. And so for the next few years, I was always trying to get diving. I still lived in London at this point, but I was constantly trying to get away diving on holiday in different places. So after a few years of that, I decided to pack in my job in London and make the ocean my full-time office. And since that decision, I've been lucky enough to dive in a number of different places around the world. I've worked in Mozambique and in South Africa as a scuba instructor, a shark educator, an intern manager, and I was lucky enough to help out on collecting some data for some shark research, which is the photo you see here. And over these years that I have been working in the marine science and marine conservation world, I've been lucky enough to dive with a number of different sharks, some small, only about 1 meter long, like the epaulet shark, but then I've also been lucky enough to swim with the largest fish in the ocean, the whale shark. And so I've had some amazing experiences, and every time I get in the water with sharks, it's a new and unique experience that I absolutely love. And that's why I do what I do, because I just want to try and transfer some of that passion, that excitement and that interest in sharks onto more and more people. But when COVID-19 hit in 2020, I had to come back to London, but I didn't want to stop the education there and stop reaching more people. So I started up the brand Ginger Under the Sea and started giving numerous talks about shark conservation to schools and universities and anyone that would listen. And since that time, I've given talks to over 2,000 students in the last year and a half, all about shark conservation and what we can do to protect them. So what are you going to get from today's talk? Well, the main things I want you all to take away from today's talk is a bit more of an understanding on biodiversity and why sharks are so important for it. And then looking at the current situation that sharks are in globally at the moment. And then finally, how we can help and what we can do, or what you can do as individuals to help protect sharks. And the main idea that I want everyone to come away with today is that you can have an impact. Every one of you who's watching this, if you make small changes, or if you continue to learn about sharks or learn about the ocean, everyone does make a difference and makes an impact. So first of all, let's look at biodiversity and what it actually means. So biodiversity is basically the number of species, that's animals and plant species, that is within a certain region or a certain area, what we could call an ecosystem. So for example, we could call a reef an ecosystem, so you could judge the biodiversity on a reef by the number of species that are there, but it's the same for a forest or a desert or a town even. You know, all of these are regions or locations with ecosystems in them. So what does good or high biodiversity mean? Well, it means that there's going to be a high number of different species all taking up the same sort of area, like I said, maybe a coral reef. And this means that there's going to be very complex food webs. It's not just going to be a very sort of straight line, almost like a food chain. I know a lot of people learn it as sort of a food chain, which is just one animal directly above the other. But in fact, when there's a healthy ecosystem, it's much more of a web with lots of different animals on different levels, and some will eat animals on one level below, but then also 2 levels below, and it's a much more complex web. And with good, high biodiversity, that food web is going to be more and more complex, which is really good, and we'll talk about why that's good in a second. Another factor with high or good biodiversity is that they're very resilient to change. And that means if an external factor such as temperature or food or anything like that changes, there's a good chance that certain species will survive within that ecosystem. Because there's such a high biodiversity going on there, there's a good chance that at least a few of those species will be able to adapt quick enough, or will be able to change their behaviors quick enough in order to survive. And then finally, probably the most important feature of high biodiversity ecosystems is that they're highly productive, which means that there's lots of animals and plants that are going to be reproducing, and there's going to be lots of like literally raw material, whether that's in plant matter or literally in animals, that are being produced on this ecosystem, which not only helps the health of the ecosystem because there's a lot of food for the other animals, the animals higher up in the food chain, but that also makes it more beneficial to us if we are actually harvesting this ecosystem for our own food resources, such as fishing or harvesting the plants. So now if we look at the bad or the low biodiversity, this obviously means that there is a low variety of species in that ecosystem, and therefore there's a much simpler food web going on. Like I said, it may even come back to that sort of almost very simple food chain where it's very linear and there's not lots of overlap and crisscrossing and things like that. And due to these factors, the low biodiversity ecosystems are much less resilient or much more vulnerable to changes in the environment. So they're less likely to survive if there are some changes such as temperature to the environment, which, as you probably know, is something that we do have to start considering as global climate change does start to get worse and worse. A lot of these environments are going to be experiencing changes in their external factors, whether it's temperature or rainfall or acidity, and therefore having a high biodiversity ecosystem is much more likely to survive any of these changes that come along because of climate change, unlike the low biodiversity ecosystems, which are much more likely to collapse and turn into sort of wastelands where there's very, very little life due to these changes in the environment and climate due to this low biodiversity. And then finally, with this bad or low biodiversity, there's very low productivity as well. So there's not much animal or plant life being produced, or not nearly as much as if it had a high biodiversity. And therefore it's less beneficial to the high level predators such as sharks, but also less beneficial for us if we are harvesting or trying to access resources from these ecosystems. So what do sharks have to do with biodiversity? Well, sharks are considered a keystone species. This means they are a species that has a disproportionate impact on the rest of the ecosystem in comparison to their actual sheer numbers. So it means that sharks are by far not the most populous fish in the oceans, but in fact, the presence of sharks has a much larger impact on the rest of the species in that environment than many other fish species do. And they do this mainly by being a top predator. And by being this top predator, they have a few behaviors that really keep the ocean ecosystems healthy. First of all, they stop any one species overpopulating, as sharks will predate on the easiest species to hunt. And if there's absolutely loads of just one species swimming around on the reef, they're much more likely to hunt that because there's just so many of them. And by doing this, they stop any one species really overpopulating, and therefore it keeps the biodiversity, so the number of different fish species that are able to live on a coral reef, for example, much, much higher. So they straight away keep the biodiversity nice and high by stopping any one species sort of overtaking and becoming the dominant fish species, taking up all the niches of the coral reef. Next, they will generally hunt and kill the weaker and the ill and diseased fish. And therefore this stops disease spreading throughout an ecosystem as well. And this is really important because if the sharks weren't there, disease can spread through an ecosystem very quickly as the fish become ill and diseased but don't necessarily die straight away, where sharks will come in and they will be killing and eating the diseased fish much earlier on, and therefore the disease doesn't get nearly as much of a chance to spread. And this is really, really important. So these two factors basically mean that sharks keep the ecosystems, whether it's a reef ecosystem or seabeds or mangroves, they tend to keep those ecosystems much healthier and also much more biodiverse. And this is really important to all of us, as I'm sure you'll know from all the other things we're learning about the ocean over these few days, is that the oceans are massively important to us living on land, as they produce up to 85% of the oxygen that we breathe. That means that every other breath you take is actually coming from the ocean. It's been produced in the ocean through phytoplankton or other microscopic animals that are due to a really healthy ocean ecosystem. The oceans also absorb a lot of carbon dioxide, which again you probably know is a very damaging gas that we're releasing into the atmosphere. So the oceans absorb a lot of that, which help reduce the climate change impacts. And then finally, the oceans absorb a lot of heat from the sun and from our own emissions, which again is really, really important in order to reduce and sort of remove the impacts of global climate change. So therefore, it's really important for us to have healthy ocean ecosystems, for us to have healthy land ecosystems. And it's also really, really important for the economy. Billions of dollars worth of resources are taken from the ocean every year in fish and minerals and seaweed and all these different factors. And again, all of these need healthy ocean ecosystems in order to continue to produce and be made and therefore be readily available for us to take, hopefully sustainably. So it's really, really important for us to have a healthy ocean ecosystem, and therefore it's really important for us to protect the sharks, which help keep this ecosystem really healthy. So what we're going to do now is we are going to watch a video which just explains and shows to you the kind of role that keystone species play in an ecosystem. Now this video is about wolves and their role in the Yellowstone National Park. This is very much the same kind of role that sharks play in the ocean.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So now we've seen how sharks play that vital role in the ocean. Let's look at a few facts so that we understand sharks a little bit better. First of all, sharks have a cartilage skeleton, which is different from almost all other fish in the ocean. This makes them more flexible and much lighter in the water, which possibly makes them more efficient and more effective hunters. They are also extremely old, which is one of the most incredible and amazing facts about sharks, is that they are over 400 million years old. That means they were in the ocean about 150 million years before the dinosaurs even existed. And they were some of the first large vertebrates in the world through evolution. So they really are ancient animals, and over this 400 million years, they have adapted and evolved to become the ultimate top efficient predator that they are in the oceans today. Another thing that's really important to understand about sharks, which again a lot of people miss, is something that I mentioned at the start in my intro, is that sharks are really varied. Like I said, I've swum with sharks that are just a meter long. I've also swam with whale sharks which are up to 20 meters long, and they're absolute biggest. There's also some sharks that live down thousands of meters deep in the pitch black deep oceans. But there's also sharks that live very, very shallow waters and actually can leave the ocean briefly to sort of walk between rock pools in order to hunt. So they're really, really varied. There's in fact over 500 different species of sharks that we know of. And I say that we know of because there are regularly new species of sharks being discovered every single year. So there's likely to be quite a few more shark species than we even know of right now. So they're massively varied, and we need to start picturing sharks more like that, as most people who picture sharks will probably only picture a great white shark, maybe a tiger shark, or maybe one or two other sharks that they've seen on sort of TV programs. But in fact, there's over 500 different species, all different shapes and sizes and colors, and eat different things and behave different ways. And so they're really, really quite a diverse group of species. And then finally, as I've mentioned a few times, that sharks are the top ocean predator, or at least many species of shark are the top ocean predator, and many other species are sort of one level below that, still being ocean predators, but not necessarily at the top of the food chain or the food web. Now, a few other facts just so that we can learn how incredibly unique and special sharks are, is that they actually have two extra senses that we do not have. One of them being the incredible electroreception sense, which means they can actually detect current of electricity in their prey source. So all living animals will create an electrical impulse through our muscle contractions, and particularly our heart contractions. And sharks can actually detect this electrical activity, these minute electrical currents that are produced by fishes and their prey sources' heartbeats in order to hunt. Now, they can only sense this around a meter or max 2 meters away, but that's still an incredible sense that to us is just, not even barely imaginable. But they have this incredible ability to actually sense and detect tiny electrical currents. They also have very, very unique tooth structures, and every shark species has a slightly different tooth structure. And you can see this is a great example, this photo of a tiger shark here. You can see they have almost can opener style teeth, which is perfect for ripping and tearing their prey. But then other sharks will have very pointy and long teeth, which is much better just for grabbing like fish and that they're going to swallow whole. And then other sharks have very flat plate-like teeth, which are perfect for crushing crustaceans and other shelled organisms that is their food source. And then finally, one of the most important factors to understand about sharks, which is heavily researched now but still isn't fully understood, is that they are actually highly intelligent animals, and they've even been shown to be able to learn to respond to different stimulus and different shapes and colors. And they're actually much more intelligent than most people think, and they have the brain to body weight ratio the same as or better than most birds and even a lot of mammals as well. So some of the features that are really important for us to understand about sharks in terms of their conservation is their reproduction. As obviously, in terms of conservation, we need to take into consideration how well an animal reproduces in order to know how vulnerable it is to decline. Now, sharks use what is called K-selection reproduction, which is opposed to the R selection, which most other fish use. And K selection reproduction means that these sharks generally live very long periods of time. So just to give you an idea, sharks such as the whale shark are thought to live over 100 years old. And in fact, the photo is a photo of a Greenland shark. And scientists relatively recently, a few years ago, studied a group of Greenland sharks, and they thought the average age of those Greenland sharks was probably around 392 years old. So those sharks that they were studying were nearly 400, possibly nearly 500 years old, which is thought to be possibly the oldest living vertebrates on the planet. So you can see that many sharks are very long-lived. They also mature very slowly, which is a really important factor to understand again when we look at their conservation. So many sharks take 10, 20, even 30 or 40 years to reach sexual maturity. And again, to give you sort of an extreme example of this, the Greenland shark, which we know to live possibly 300 to 400 years, are thought not to reach sexual maturity until around 150 years old. And this means that they cannot reproduce until they reach this sexual maturity age. For Greenland sharks, 150 years, which is an extremely long time. And this can make sharks very vulnerable to decline, as it's very easy to capture and kill sharks. If we are capturing and killing them, it's very easy to capture and kill them before they have reached sexual maturity and before they've had a chance to reproduce. And as you can imagine, as long as a shark has had a chance to reproduce, then at least that number can stay stable. Where if you're killing sharks before they're reproducing, then the numbers are just going to be declining. And a final factor that also makes it so important to understand why sharks' conservation needs to be treated differently is that they have very few but very well developed young, and quite often they'll have a few years gap in between breeding cycles. So some sharks will literally only have 2 pups every 2 to 3 years, which is very, very slow for reproduction, especially if we compare this to many bony fish, which will literally lay hundreds of thousands of eggs every single year in the hope that at least a few of them will survive to adulthood. So let's look at sharks at the moment around the world and their situation. So unfortunately, the majority of shark species around the world are rapidly declining in the oceans. And it's thought that around 1/3 of all shark species are threatened with extinction. And some species have seen a huge decline, more so than others. For example, the oceanic species such as the oceanic white tip and thresher sharks and blue sharks have seen massive declines. And I've just got a quote from a study that was literally published just a few months ago that studied around 25 different species of oceanic sharks and rays. And they saw a 71% decline in shark numbers in just the last 50 years. So that means they're losing their population by faster than 1% a year, which, doesn't take very complex maths to know that if we continue at the rate we're at, it's only going to take 1, maybe 2 decades until we see the extinction of many species of sharks and rays. So it's quite obvious to say that sharks are in urgent need of our protection. So let's look at the main threats to sharks. And I've got a quote from an official report on an industry. And I want you guys to listen to the quote and think if you think that this is a really damaging and bad industry, and also if it's legal or possibly illegal. So this report on this industry said that there was an annual estimate of interactions with at least 20 million individuals of endangered, threatened and or protected species. And those interactions are going to be negative. So they're going to be either that they've been caught and pulled up on a line or a hook. It means that they're going to have either been killed or injured or exhausted or some sort of, it's going to be a negative interaction. That's not just going to be an interaction of sort of seeing them in the water and leaving them alone. 20 million individuals of species that are already considered threatened or protected. And there's 20 million in just 1 year. Do you think that's a good industry or bad industry? And do you think that's actually legal? Having an industry that's, possibly killing or injuring 20 million individuals every single year that are already threatened with extinction? Well, the scary thing is that that was actually a report from a global fishing study. So this is a problem that we all need to be talking about a lot more, and that is the global commercial fishing industry, or you could call it the overfishing industry. As I'll take another quote from that 2021 study that I talked about 2 slides ago about the sharks with a 71% decline. They directly stated that that 71% decline was owing to an 18-fold increase in relative fishing pressure. So that means those sharks are trying to withstand an 18-fold increase in hooks in the water, nets, dredging, trawlers, all these sort of things. There is 18-fold more than there was just 50 years ago, which is just crazy to think. And if we look at this graph on the slide here, you can see that around the 1950s, there was only around 20 million tons of fish being caught around the ocean, around the world. Now this does sound like a huge number still, 20 million tons, but the oceans are very large and that was relatively sustainable. We can sort of assume that back then the sheer amount of fishing that was happening and the way it was being fished was relatively sustainable around the world, apart from a few places. However, over the next 40 or 50 years, fishing techniques changed. We used bigger nets, new materials, we had more powerful boats, they had refrigeration on ships. All these changes came in, and therefore fish capture started rising up. And you can see just in a 40-year period, that number from 20 million quadrupled to over 80 million in just 40 years. And you can see since then, that number hasn't actually particularly increased. If we're looking at the orange section of the graph, which is wild caught fish, hasn't really increased much more since the 1990s. And that isn't because fishing efforts aren't still increasing or that the fishing industry has sort of stepped back and let things recover. In fact, it's just because there is not enough fish in the ocean for the fishing industry to be able to catch any more. In fact, every year the fishing industry is having to try harder, put more boats out, put more hours in just to catch the same amount of fish because there's just not so many anymore. They're becoming sparse, they're becoming rarer to catch, especially the big game species are harder to find, but also the huge shoals of fish that used to exist 60, 70 years ago, those huge shoals just don't really exist anymore. So we really have to look at what the global fishing industry is doing to the planet and to our oceans and try and work out what we can do. Now, why is this topic not talked about more? Or why do people not realize the damage that the fishing industry is doing? Well, that's partially because most people still see the fishing industry like these photos. You've got a nice small boat there with a couple of fishermen on it in, your local harbour, and you may even have the image of Captain Birdseye walking around on his lovely wooden decked ship with his fish fingers. And that's how people picture their fish is getting onto their plate. Unfortunately, what people don't picture is the reality of it, which is more like this. Using huge nets, hundreds of meters long, that can literally fit jumbo jets inside these nets, that are dragged along the seafloor for hours on end, catching literally tons and tons of fish every single minute of every day around the world. Or they don't picture the huge, what some people would call killing machines, that are the big sort of super trawlers of today. As you can see that boat there, that is realistically the image of commercial fishing now. Those huge ships with massive nets, massive lines that are catching tons and tons of fish around the world every day of the year. And this is the image that people just don't realize when we look at the commercial fishing industry. The fish you buy in the supermarket or at the restaurant, unless you find out differently, it's likely to have been caught using commercial methods, which is going to be something similar to what you see here. So another one of the big problems with commercial fishing at the moment is bycatch. Bycatch is basically an animal or a species that is caught that was not the target species. So a really good example of that is a shrimp trawl. Shrimp trawlers are obviously fishing for shrimp. So they will drag a net along the seafloor in the hope of catching lots and lots of shrimp. However, there is a lot of other things caught in the net, and that is considered bycatch. And you can see in that photo there, you can see some shrimp, all those pink bits there, but how much of that actual trawler net worth of fish is actual shrimp? And you can see it really isn't that much. And some shrimp trawlers, which are probably the worst type of fishing around the world, actually have a bycatch rate of up to 80 or 90%. So that means that 80 or 90% of the life that is in a shrimp trawling net is not actually shrimp. And most of that will die in the net or die on the boat or maybe get thrown back in the ocean alive, but won't survive very long because of the injury or the exhaustion or the sort of stress that they've gone through by being caught in that net. And bycatch doesn't include only sharks. It can include turtles, dolphins, whales, seals, sea lions, seabirds, other big game fish that aren't targets. Almost anything else that is in the ocean can get caught up in fishing gear and does get caught up in fishing gear. Around millions and millions of animals are killed around the world every single year in order to catch the fish that we get to our plates. Now, they're not always killed. Sometimes they are released back into the ocean alive, and some will survive, but a lot will perish. And also sometimes these animals are kept on board to be sold for whatever money they're worth if they are a valuable species, but they won't usually be kept, or they won't usually be as valuable as obviously whatever their target species want. And just to put it in perspective, a recent study showed that there's around 9.1 million tons of bycatch every single year. 9.1 million tons. That's nearly more than 10% of everything that's caught by the fishing industry is bycatch and isn't actually targeted and is pretty much likely to be wasted or die on the way back or sold sort of for really cheap. So bycatch is one of the really big problems that we do need to address as well. So how can we change this? How can you as an individual or us as a community change this? Well, first of all, we need to learn more about sharks, and we need to educate more people and help more people understand about sharks, because the more we understand about animals, the more we tend to love them and be interested in them. So hopefully from this talk today, you're already a bit more interested in sharks and feel a bit closer to them and are more interested in them. So continue learning about sharks in any way you can, because the more we learn, the more we love something. And then also spread that awareness of sharks around, because again, the more people that understand about what sharks are really like, not this evil, dangerous animal in the ocean, but actually a really highly intelligent, very, very important animal in the ocean. So we need to spread that awareness so that more and more people understand that sharks need to be put as a priority to protect the oceans, along with many, many other things. And also increasing the awareness of the fishing industry so that more people understand where their fish comes from, and then they can make those choices. And then finally, the major thing, or the most direct thing that you can do to help protect shark species, but also turtles and dolphins and whales, is to consider the impact. What is the impact of the fish that you have on your plate, and what impact do you want to have on the oceans? Obviously, if you completely cut out fish from your diet, then that's reducing your impact as much as you can. If you do still have fish in your diet, then make sure it is sustainably caught, so it's not caught using big trawler nets which are going to be catching dolphins and turtles and sharks in their nets, and that it's a species that isn't in rapid decline and in a dangerous way and close to extinction. So that brings me to the end of the talk and has given you a few things to think about and sort of know what to do in order to help protect the oceans. If you want to learn more, then feel free to follow me on any social medias. I'm constantly putting out more and more information. I'm on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube as Ginge Under the Sea. And also I do these talks and similar talks to schools and other organisations. So if you think that your school may benefit from this talk, then do feel free to get in contact. My email address is there. Get in contact with me and maybe we can book in more talks and I can help show more and more people why sharks are so important to the ecosystem. There's also going to be a load of resources that you guys can look at, lots of websites that are going to be really helpful if you want to continue learning about sharks. They all have lots of different information, some conservation based, some more sort of facts and information about sharks as a general, such as All for Blue, Shark Guardian, Shark Trust, Shark Water. All of these places have really, really great information on. And then when it comes to seafood awareness, there are there are a number of organizations that you can use to double check if your seafood is caught sustainably. I would recommend watching a documentary such as Seaspiracy or Mission Blue or End of the Line, just to continue educating yourself about the fishing industry at the moment. But you can use those websites, the MCS and the MSC, in order to check over, if you decide to continue eating fish, make sure that it is sustainably caught. And then finally, if you do want to continue learning about sharks, then this is a perfect timing for you really, because I'm just about to launch next month a brand new online sharks course, which is basically going to be all the information that I could gather together about sharks all in one place on one easily accessible online course. So the link should be below. If you want to register your interest, then do click on the link below, register your interest, and you'll get an email as soon as it goes live. It's going to be on Udemy, but also on Shark Guardian's website, so keep an eye out there. And this is just going to be a great place in order to learn a lot more about sharks and really have a great comprehensive understanding about everything to do with sharks, their conservation, their anatomy, and everything. So if you're a shark lover, that course is going to be perfect for you. And finally, I also have a YouTube channel, as I mentioned, so check that out. Go and subscribe. That's another great place in order to help learn more about sharks, marine conservation, and also a bit about diving as well. So thank you for joining my talk today. If you're joining on the live straight after, then great, you can ask your questions there. If you can't join on the live, or you don't get your question answered during the live, then do feel free to contact me through social media or gingerunderthesea on my email address in order to ask questions, and I will make sure I get back to you, hopefully with the answer or somewhere you can find the answer. But thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of World Oceans Day, and let's move on to the live Q&A.
Wow, I learned so much, and I imagine that you did too. That was a fantastic presentation by Greg, taking us all the way through the world's oceans, discovering about biodiversity, about the importance of sharks, and very sadly about the threats they are under. But I loved the fact that we ended on a note of hope, and that we can all work together to save these incredible creatures, not these frightening monsters from Jaws, but these really important and beautiful creatures, and so important for our healthy oceans. Now, hopefully we can connect to Greg live, because I know that we have some fantastic questions that you've been sending through, and please do send through more. Greg, are you there? We are just trying to connect.
Hello, guys.
Hi, Greg. Great
Hi.
to be with us. Now, we will work our way through this connection. But we've got a bit of delay, but I'm just going to put these questions through. The first one is from P4-7 at Borg Primary School, who would love to know, what is your favorite shark?
Oh, that is always a hard question. And I don't think I've ever really been able to give a definite answer. In terms of actually being in the water with a shark, I think so far, my favorite shark to be with is the blue shark, which is literally just off our coastline, can be found in lots of places around the UK. I was lucky enough to swim with them last year off Cornwall, and they're incredible sharks to actually spend time with in the water there, because they're oceanic sharks. So they actually spend all their time quite far out to sea. They're really, really inquisitive. So they're really interested in what you are in their sort of environment. So they come right in and sort of investigate you, and they almost sort of nose bump you like a sort of a puppy or a dog would, to try and investigate you. They're not, obviously they're still sharks. There's still a little bit of sort of potential risk there, but they're not particularly dangerous at all. And they're really incredible sharks to swim with, because they're just so interested in you, and they're just this beautiful magnetic blue as well. So it's a stunning shark to be with, and it's just so cool that they're literally off our coastline all around the UK.
Brilliant. I mean, you mentioned all around the UK with the blue shark. There's a follow-up question from Ball Primary School, which is what other sharks can we find around the UK's waters, and specifically from this school around Scotland's coasts?
Okay, great question. There's lots of different sharks and ray species that can be found around the UK. I think it's over 20. I think it's 24, but I wouldn't quote me on that. So there's lots of different sharks around the UK. Scotland is particularly famous for its basking sharks, which are the second biggest shark in the world. They grow up to 10 meters long, which is the same size as like a London bus or a school bus. So they are absolutely huge sharks, and they are regularly found in the summer. So around this time, up in Scotland, as well as off the coast of Ireland and Wales and southeast England as well. So definitely, I think the basking shark is one of the top picks of sharks off the Scottish coast, but there's lots of other sharks as well. You get angel sharks, spotted catfish, which are sharks, or spotted cat sharks, and a number of, you've even got makos and other really quite larger predatory sharks, but they're often much further out to sea, so you're not going to get a chance to see them. But basking sharks, they're seen near the coast, and you can do plenty of different trips to actually go and snorkel with basking sharks, which is an absolutely unique experience.
Well, that sounds a really fab way of getting close to some of our fantastic marine life, and particularly for lots of those of us who are spending a more local summer than we may have done, an opportunity to see whether we can experience basking sharks. The next question, Greg, is from Anglesey, from homeschoolers there. And they're wondering, is there a most important species of shark?
That is a really good question. I'd have to say no. Definitely different shark species will play different roles in the environment. Generally lower down on the food chain, are less sort of influential on the whole food chain. As you saw in my talk, the ones that are at the top, the apex predators, they have an impact on all of the levels below them. So sharks that are lower on the food chain may impact less different species. But in general, because sharks fill in so many different areas, so you've got some sharks in warmer tropical waters, you've got some sharks up in coastal waters, up in sort of the northern hemisphere, then you've got sharks up in the Arctic. So there's definitely not one shark that has more power to control the environment than others. It really is a big group thing. This group of sharks are, as a whole across the world, this sort of keystone species, as I talked about. So it really is important to protect every species of shark, as it is to protect so many other different species of animals as well, including birds and marine mammals and fish and all sorts.
I mean, thank you, Greg. And returning to that point of the great connectivity of life on the planet and in the ocean. The next question, I think, is really going for that shark high in the imagination of a lot of young people watching. And the question is, what would happen if the Megalodon returned and ate all the sharks?
Okay, that's a question I haven't got before. Theoretically, if the Megalodon did return, interestingly, it would eat some sharks. Its main source of food was actually the whales, particularly the smaller of the whale species. So likely that whales' numbers would decline because they would be getting hunted more. Interestingly, when the Megalodon went extinct, which is only around 4 to 6 million years ago, the size of our baleen whales actually started increasing. So it's really interesting that their size was obviously limited by the presence of the Megalodon. So possibly over time, maybe the size would sort of shrink back down in reaction to the Megalodon coming back. But like they said, the Megalodon might eat some sharks, some sort of basking sharks or great white sharks, sort of similar sized prey to small whales. No doubt it would have a big impact on the environment and the ecosystem due to them being absolute top predators. They may even start competing with orcas, which are obviously the most top predator, if you can say the most top. in the oceans, as they do also sometimes predate on sort of the largest sharks like the great whites. So they might be in direct competition, Megalodon and Orca, but no one knows what would really happen, as we're not entirely sure what the Megalodon did, what its position was in the food chain in 4-6 million years ago.
Brilliant. Thank you, Greg. Next question is from Jack. And Jack sort of obviously wants your job, but is asking to get there, sort of what GCSEs do you have, and what advice could you give him to become a researcher or a conservationist?
Okay, yeah, brilliant question. So GCSEs, I think the relatively standard ones, obviously biology will be the best one, because that is the study of sort of living things, which then you can later on specialize going towards the marine side and then onto sharks. But I would say my advice is just sort of do what you find most interesting and you enjoy most and you're best at, and what you really want to do. And if you really want to get into shark conservation or marine conservation or whatever these other topics are, you will always find a way to get into that area with your passion and your enthusiasm and your skills. So, for example, I'm not a marine biologist. I didn't study sharks or marine biology at university, but my passion is educating people and teaching people about these things. So I made sure I did a lot of my own research. I did have a level in biology, so my scientific knowledge was good, and my degree helped me in the science side of things. But then it's about continuing to learn about what you are passionate about. So yes, all the education in school and then in college and then at university will all be brilliant. And if you absolutely want to get into marine science as a marine biologist, then yes, you do need to go through the steps through university and through a degree. But if you just have an absolute interest and awe in sharks, but you actually find that you are much more creative and you like painting, or you like teaching other people, or maybe you even like things like law. If you're really interested in law, but you love sharks as well, then there is a role for you, because we need to help protecting sharks and instilling law in government. So whatever your interest is, keep doing what you love and what you enjoy, and you will find a way to sort of link that with your other passions, such as sharks and conservation, and it'll go from there. So don't stress too much about exactly what subjects to study. Do what you enjoy and you love. Learn about sharks and other things in the meantime, at home, online, through books, and it will all come together.
Greg, really brilliant advice there. Thank you so much. We've got quite a few questions, so we might just enter a bit of a quick fire round, if that's okay. Although I know that not always these questions can be summed up in a short, pithy sort of like sentence, but let's try. From Team 40, we have, what's the best place to see sharks?
So in the UK would be sort of Cornwall and off the Welsh coast and the Irish coast. Basically everything off to sort of the southwest corner of the UK. There's lots of different places to see sharks there. If you're looking more further afield, the Caribbean, South Africa, and Australia are well-traveled places that have lots and lots of sharks in. And I'm going to keep it at that.
Perfect, thank you. Sort of wider point on some of the overfishing points you were making. What percentage of the fish that we eat, potentially, in the UK, is sustainable?
Oof, that is a number that I don't actually know. It's not enough, because if you think about any unsustainable fishing is doing a negative, has having negative impact on the ocean. So really, we have to aim to get to 100% sustainable fish in our supermarkets, in our fishmongers and everything. And we also have to look at reducing the amount of fish as well, because if we all ate the same amount of fish as we do now, it still wouldn't be sustainable, because that's still too many fish being pulled out of our ocean. So it's a balance between making sure we eat sustainably and also just reducing the total amount of fish eaten as well.
Important message. Thank you, Greg. And I know that at the bottom of this live lesson page, there are some links to various organisations, including the Marine Stewardship Council, who have guides on sustainable fish and what are the best species to eat if you are going to eat a little bit of fish in your diet. Question coming up from King's Court School. Do sharks make noises, or how do they communicate?
Oh, excellent question. I love that one. I will keep it short though. So yes, they don't really make any noise at all. They actually communicate through body language. And obviously humans use body language as well, even though a lot of people don't seem to understand it. But we do use body language as one of our first forms of communication. And that's what sharks do. The way they swim, the position of their fins, their speed, their mouth position, all of this stuff is communicating to other sharks. And it's really interesting if you go into that field of study or you start learning about their behavior. There's lots of very subtle behaviors and sort of movements that you can start to see the communication between sharks.
Thank you, Greg. The next question is fascinating. You touched on it in your presentation there. Do we have any idea about how many unknown species of shark there might be?
Well, again, that's it is an unknown question. Who knows how many there are? We've found around 500, and I think the number's 526 at the moment. But there has literally been 2 or 3 sharks discovered in the last year. It's getting slower as we are able to dive deeper and explore more of the depths of the ocean, but it's likely there are still a fair few. Whether it's 5 more to find or whether it's 100 more, no one really knows. But we're almost certain that there's sharks that we still have not even got a clue exist. Amazing
to think that there's so much life on this planet that hasn't been discovered by science yet.
Yeah.
A couple of questions on sort of shark behavior, which I love. The first one is: do sharks live in groups or are they solitary?
Another brilliant question. I love these. These are such interesting topics to be able to go into in much more detail. Even though sharks are always seen as solitary, everyone thinks of sharks as this sort of lone predator, this really angry, mean animal. In fact, lots of sharks do group for different reasons. Some sharks just group because of food sources. So if there's lots of food in one area, obviously they're going to group together. One shark that's actually known to group probably for social reasons is the scalloped hammerhead. So they seem to group in groups of hundreds of scalloped hammerheads during the day. And no one really fully understands why, but it is thought, since there's no feeding going on, there's no mating going on, it is thought that these sharks do congregate for social reasons. But many other sharks do congregate. They rest together. White-tipped reef sharks are regularly found in small groups under caves. And some sharks do hunt together. The blunt-nosed sixgill is one of the only sharks to have been sort of witnessed actually hunting as a pack. So a bit like a wolf, they actually work as a team to surround a prey source and then sort of move in to attack it. So there's many different ways that sharks do work together in a sort of a community or a social group. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Greg. Very sadly, we've got time for one more question, and it is, what is the most unique shark?
Oh God. And to keep this short, I don't know, there's a few that come to mind. First of all, the goblin shark is very unique, very deep shark, and it can actually retract or extend its jaw out sort of the same distance of its jaw again, which is really cool. But I think my personal choice has to be the ragged-tooth shark, which is a shark that lots of people can dive with. They're off South Africa, off the American coast, and off the Australian coast, easy to dive with. And they have really a few really unique traits. One is that they actually come up to the surface of the water and gulp air to create a small swim bladder inside their stomach so they can actually hover in the water. And that's the only shark known to do that. And then the other amazing thing with spotted ragged-tooth sharks is they use a thing called interuterine cannibalism for their reproduction, which, put shortly, basically means that inside the uterus of the female, when the embryos or the fetuses get to a certain length, about a finger length, some of the fetuses will actually go around and eat or kill and eat the other embryos inside the uterus in order for them to grow really large. Again, this is one of the only sharks to be known to use this interuterine cannibalism, where the babies eat each other before they're even born in order to grow up to a meter in length before they're born, which I just think is just mind-blowing that goes on inside the female. So that's got to be my most unique shark.
That is pretty unique, and just where we're at the point of rehabilitating sharks in the popular imagination, from being the sort of like sea monsters and into crucial parts of a marine ecosystem. But Greg, just to say thank you so much again. Thank you so much for putting that great presentation together and for answering so many of these questions being sent in. Just for those classes watching, there are lots more resources for today and for tomorrow to carry on celebrating World Ocean Day. You can find those on the worldoceanday.school website. But for now, it's a big thank you to Greg, and it's a goodbye to all those classes watching. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.